Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining me. Really looking forward to the presentation. Thanks for being part of the Communications Academy and allowing me to be part of it as well. So this will be an interesting topic, I hope, for all of you, maybe a new way of looking at things and how we prepare for the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and maybe just reframing how we prepare for everything in general. So I'm looking forward to it, and thanks again for joining me. All right, so let's go right into when we're on an island. And yes, I do know that we are not actually on an island, but you may find out that we easily could be. Going to spend 30 or 45 minutes thereabouts talking about why we plan for islands. Like I said, I know we're not on an island, but we easily could be. How bad could that be? That's the second thing we'll talk about, is how bad could island living be after a large-scale disaster. I'm going to talk a little bit about not just earthquakes, but how we actually have this islanding right now. We actually have this happen more frequently than we imagine sometimes. So talk a little bit about how it applies even in our not so bad disasters. And then finally, talk about next steps. And that's going to be a critical piece because everybody listening in is going to play a role in that. So that's how we're going to get from here to there. Let's start talking about, though, why we plan for this. I think most folks who are actually listening in right now are familiar with the Cascadia Subduction Zone. Certainly, if you live in the Pacific Northwest, it's familiar to you. You've heard a lot about it. We did a large exercise with the support of FEMA, along with our partners around Washington and Oregon and Alaska, and even British Columbia back in 2016. And there's another large exercise called Cascadia Rising 2022, which is coming up. It's a massive earthquake fault line, 700 miles long, capable of generating up to, it seems like, magnitude 10. We know it's happened in our history, and we know that because on that exact date, the Japanese actually recorded the water coming in. So we actually have their written detailing of what happened after the Cascadia Subduction Zone. We also have some local oral history from native tribes who talk about the water being receding very quickly and then coming back and washing folks away. What a lot of people don't really know, we talk about recurrence. 300 to 800 years is generally what our friends at the USGS talk about. For this slide, which was provided by CREW, the Cascadia Region Earthquake Work Group, the average is 500 years. So when you look at that average recurrence, you maybe think, well, we're not quite there. We're not. When you look at the recurrence interval of 300 to 800 years, we're actually within 300 years. And so they've calculated that the odds of this happening within the next 50 years are going to be somewhere between 1 in 10. So think about sort of the things you do with your life and the things that might happen to you in the next 50 years, and think about one of them being a massive ground shake that lasts 5 to 6 minutes and creates devastation along perhaps hundreds of miles of waterfront and all the way inland to I-5 and beyond. I think most of us would say, hey, if those are my odds, those aren't great. And I'm going to have to do something, to get prepared for that. So that's kind of what sets us up for how bad things could be. That's really the thing that could really generate this issue of islands. And they can happen. And if you don't know who that is on the left-hand side, you can Google it. Most of you probably should, I hope. Certainly I am dating myself. We're not going to Fantasy Island now. We're going to go to the Snohomish County Island, which is where we've done a lot of work in looking at how we can become an island and how we can prepare as islands in our community. How do we get there? We've got the Cascadia Subduction Zone. All it really needs to do is trigger. And you can see on this right-hand side the shaking intensity for the state of Washington. Like I mentioned, That's pretty significant ground shaking all the way past the I-5 corridor. In our case, in Snohomish County, which is right here, pretty significant shaking pretty much into through all of our populated areas. And we're quite a ways from the Cascadia Subduction Zone. So what is that going to do? Well, it's going to create a lot of islands, quite frankly. It's going to create infrastructure damage that we think right now is going to take years potentially to repair. Now, a couple things to keep in mind when we talk about earthquake damage and infrastructure damage on a scale of Cascadia. The stuff you see here, these data points, these little bits of bad news, come from us from a program called High Track that was run before the Cascadia Rising 2016 exercise. I put them in here because there are now other tools that have been developed, one being the bridge seismic safety tool and the other being the highway seismic safety tool that we're using to refine this. And those numbers, believe it or not, generally look a lot worse. That's not good. When we talk about years to repair, one of the things that sometimes folks don't realize is when we look at the damages that are on here, when FEMA modeling looks at this, it actually takes into account each bridge, each span individually. So what I mean by that is if a bridge goes down, the modeling may calculate that it will take 2 years to repair, but that assumes it's the only bridge that's down. If you look at all those red dots, and if you can read that little eye test on the bottom, underneath that graphic, it says impacted bridges. Imagine all of those bridges being down and how many contractors it's going to take, how many work crews it's going to take, how many pieces of large heavy equipment it's going to take, how much concrete, steel, everything else it's going to take to repair those. So we talk about these things as though they're sort of isolated. I live in Mount Vernon. A few years ago, courtesy of one of our Canadian friends, we dropped 100 feet of the I-5 bridge into the Skagit River. It took months to repair that single section of one side, just southbound of the I-5 bridge. Take a little look at all of those dark red dots and then the red dots, and think about all of those being a segment of that bridge that needs to get repaired and how we're going to actually get enough folks in here to fix all of those. I want you to start thinking about where you live, where you recreate, where you work. If you have kids who go to school, a spouse or a significant other who works in a location different than yours, think about how many bridges you cross, how many culverts you cross, how many overpasses you cross over or under, and think about all of those potentially being down for a long, long time. We're starting to get into the island setting mentality. You look at those data points, almost 7,000 highway bridges are what's anticipated to go down. That's a lot of opportunity to create lots and lots of islands. You all are communicators. I added this little bit because I know how much you guys love this. Guys, generic. Don't fault me for that. 682 communication facilities receiving moderate or greater damage taking weeks or months. Again, isolated estimates, not taking into effect the cumulative effect of trying to do this for 682 different places up and down the West Coast. So we're going to talk about how these islands form and how important it's going to be for you all to help us actually communicate between them. Because if you've been thinking about this disaster response to Cascadia as cities talking to cities, cities talking to counties, counties talking to the state, states talking to FEMA, at least at the local level, I think you're about to see something a little bit different that maybe is going to scream, hopefully, how important it is for you that we prepare for this. So, lots of damages. Before 2016, in Snohomish County, as part of the lead up for this, I was part of what was then called the Operational Coordination Subcommittee. So we had broken the preparation for the Cascadia Rising 2016 exercise into small subcommittees to work on different pieces that we call core capabilities. Some of you may be familiar with that term. So mine was operational coordination, which for you folks who aren't aware, it's how we do command, coordination, and control of an incident response, kind of the overall ICS, EOC to EOC, Emergency Operations Center to Emergency Operations Center. We looked at all of that, and we were talking a lot about, as we got into the lead up back in 2015, of, wow, SR 530, which was the big tragedy actually that just happened 7 years ago, had just happened in Snohomish County fairly recently. We had just gone through, and some of my staff, including myself, had gone over to the Okanagan complex fires. So we had seen how incident management was done over there and during SR 530. And we really started talking about, after a Cascadia Subduction Zone, how would the state manage to talk to potentially all 39 different counties? And the state was pretty candid. Hey, that's going to be really difficult for us. We started looking at it within Snohomish County and said, well, okay, we're a much smaller staff than the state. We have a county emergency coordination center, but we also have 20 cities and 2 tribal nations. How are we going to reach out and talk to all of them? So we started talking about, okay, well, we have some natural boundaries formed by damage that we expect after an earthquake. So maybe we could break the county into these sort of geographical regions. So we did that, and we thought, wow, this is really, we're pretty smart. Good for us. Like, we're thinking, that's pretty cool. Well, really smart folks on my staff then started sort of tinkering around, and the graphic you see is their work. And it was our GIS staff, as well as one of my planners, who started saying, well, so we have these big damages over these large key bridges that create these, sort of regions within the county. What happens if we really plot those out and see what happens, like when even smaller, not smaller in the sense of less impactful necessarily, but, not the key bridge over top of the Snohomish River, but maybe it's an overpass. Maybe it's a smaller bridge over the Salton River. What if we started plotting all of those? What would we see then that would really kind of change the way that we actually look at our response? And we started coming up with islands. So what you see on here now, and these are based upon projected damage after Cascadia, are islands of Snohomish County residents. Folks who are separated by either bridges, overpasses, sometimes culverts, significant road damage even that was going to cause long-term impacts to the infrastructure that are going to prevent these folks from being able to freely move around, at least on wheeled vehicles, might be able to get around on a bike, at least a little ways, might be able to get around on a car a little ways, but eventually you're going to hit a border. Every one of these represents some degree of humans. In our county alone, in Snohomish County, there are 67 of these. So now think about that. Pretty complex. We were talking about our cities and tribal nations. That was a big number for us. Now it's 67, 3 times as many. Now we have populations in each of these that are much different than they are in our incorporated cities or within our tribal boundaries. Much different. Some much larger, some much smaller, some really compact, some really spread out, some with actually pretty good access to things like airfields or even like helicopter spots, helispots, some that don't have really anything good. For you all, because again, I know you all are here for the Communications Academy, some that have fairly robust communications infrastructure that we think will survive, some that don't, unless we get folks like our volunteer ham radio operators who are going to help us communicate with these folks when, not if, when this happens. So you sort of start thinking about things a lot differently when you look at this map and think about, now it's not an emergency coordination center just talking with cities. It's not even an emergency coordination center talking with cities and or fire districts. In some of these, there may not even be a fire station. In some of these, there may not be any real public infrastructure. So then we started thinking, well, shoot, how do we start dealing with that? This is a way different problem than our doctrine tells us about dealing just from, different levels of government. Now we're talking about potentially groups of people, sometimes small. Yeah, I'll grant you that, sometimes small, but groups of people who may not have any real response capability or infrastructure to actually call us for help. Yeah, so we're on an island, and it's bad, right? And I hope it actually sounds bad, because you know what? It actually is. But as we started thinking about how we were going to prepare for this, we actually kind of wanted to know. I mean, we're aware that sometimes, and at one point in my life, I lived in Wyoming. Sometimes there are folks who live remotely or on sort of, kind of an island. They become really resilient, and that's cool. And we were aware of that, but we also wanted to know, like, what happens to islands when bad things happen? Well, we got a taste of that in 2017. And we actually had a great case study, a tragedy, but a great case study. Hurricane Maria hits Puerto Rico. You can see the figures on here. You can actually see Maria approaching Puerto Rico a couple of days before. Yes, I understand it's a hurricane. And yes, I understand that hurricanes are not earthquakes. Got it. But much of the damage is very similar, and I'll show you some photos of that. The death toll was actually significantly higher. As importantly as all of this is the island lost its power grid. So one of the things that we expect from a large earthquake is the loss of the power grid for a while. We expect to lose communications for a while. So that was a key thing for us to look at and think about. All right, so infrastructure damage and long-term loss of power, what does that look like? Well, it turns out, like I said, the damages, even though it was from a hurricane, actually are very much earthquake-like. You see the collapsed building on the top left and on the lower left. Buildings fell down. You see the damaged roadway, destroyed, heavily eroded, the actual road surface gone. So again, some of this is not horrible. Road surface gone, you can still cross that. But when you start seeing road erosion and road base erosion, now you're wondering if there's any stability and if it can hold anything. This neat little eye chart in the bottom, in the center right here, is one of the really cool things. Again, cool is maybe not the right term, but for us in terms of planning. So that's a chart that shows all of those red dots are landslides. One of the things we know after Cascadia is that there are going to be a lot of secondary effects. And one of those are going to be, especially if we've had any significant amount of rainfall recently and the soil's already sort of prone to landsliding, that we're going to have a lot of landslides. They had a lot of landslides on Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria. And that caused a lot of issues that I think are going to mostly sound quite a bit like what we're going to experience post-Cascadia. So stop me if you heard these, and you have, but you're going to again. So you have 3 million people without power, a little bit less than what we have in just kind of the central Puget Sound region. But without power, they can't pump water, they can't pump wastewater, and they can't get fuel for the most part, because the pumps that bring our fuel out of those cool little tanks in the ground up through that sweet little nozzle that you put into your car are generally powered by electricity. They also found out without the electrical grid that all the just-in-time food and medicine that needs protection, like refrigeration, for example, isn't really just in time. It spoils, it goes bad, and that's a problem. I showed you roads destroyed, dozens of bridges down, lots of debris management. One of the things that we don't often talk about when we sort of sort through some of these nuances of Cascadia and the Cascadia Subduction Zone, millions and millions and millions of pounds of debris that are going to have to get moved first, eventually loaded second, and then finally, when we can actually do it, hauled away. And then the network down. And this is a key thing. I imagine many of you are ham radio operators, and that's super cool technology. Unfortunately, lots of the world operates on the interwebs. Without the internet, things like just our regular transactions come to a halt. A couple of the big examples that we learned from Hurricane Maria, digital transactions along the supply chain. So things like shipments arriving that used to be inventoried or received through electronic means that are actually connected to the internet suddenly had to revert to good old pen and paper, which, by the way, people aren't real good at doing anymore. ATMs for folks who couldn't use their credit cards because, again, if there's no internet connection, there aren't any credit cards. ATMs couldn't dispense cash because, guess what? They run on an internet connection as well. So these are issues that we're actually thinking about with Cascadia and things that really happened right after Maria and lasted for weeks and in some places within Puerto Rico months. These are massive issues that we're going to have to face that happen on an island that are actually going to be affecting our dozens of islands post Cascadia. So none of that is fun. All of it seems a little overwhelming, but thankfully it's only going to happen when Cascadia happens. And you saw earlier, the recurrence is we're like 200 years out of the recurrence average, right? So nothing to worry about, right? Not true. We actually have had lots of opportunities to experience island living. We just don't actually always take them. Or maybe we take them and we don't realize that they're actually little opportunities to learn. So 1,000 years ago, before COVID, in early 2020, this slide here, this screenshot on the lower right-hand side, that's actually the eastern end of Snohomish County. It snowed a lot, as many of you will recall. That shut down the roads out past Index on US 2. For folks who don't know where Index is, you're missing out on a lovely town of 110 folks on the east side of Snohomish County. The road was cut off. Folks couldn't get out beyond it. On the east side of the pass, the road was also cut off. And so we had folks on an island. We were actually doing convoys of food out to folks who were trapped in between the two areas that were cut off. We were actually having conversations, and in one case, did helicopter overflights to kind of assess the status of the road, similar to what we would do after an earthquake. This picture up here on the upper right, that's Oregon, same year, the great year that would not stop giving, 2020. Wildfires hit parts of rural Oregon. The fire rips through, cuts down network connections, and suddenly you have folks who can't actually utilize ATMs, run credit cards, or just buy the things that they need just to get by day to day. That's in Oregon. That was 2020. And now guess what? Still 2020, like I said, the year that just wouldn't stop. PPE. It sounds a little weird, right? There wasn't sort of the isolation. It wasn't like we broke down all the infrastructure, but we had lots of different jurisdictions, states, locals, and others competing with each other, trying to get PPE. That puts a massive amount of strain on the supply chain because once you go from shipping to, one or two hubs down to all these really small distribution sites, you've got to have more people, more vehicles, more fuel, more time, everything to actually get things out to these smaller and more diffuse little areas. That's what's going to happen with islands as well. So we're going to actually see a whole bunch of amplifying of problems that were already pretty darn bad if we don't start thinking about how we actually prepare for this and get out of thinking we're just going to deal with incorporated jurisdictions that will deal with another incorporated jurisdiction that will then deal with, guess what, another incorporated level of government. So what can we do? Well, we got to stop plugging our ears, putting our head in the sand, whichever cliche you want to use. We know this problem exists. It's not necessarily the Star Destroyer in the astronaut's visor, but we are looking at the 1 in 10 chance, like I said, in the next 50 years. That's a 1 in 10 chance that those 67 islands in Snohomish County, maybe not all of them, maybe just some of them, but that they're going to become a reality. So we actually have to admit this is most likely going to happen. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but if we don't start planning for it now, we're actually wasting time that we could be using to get ready for this. So we know there's a problem. We know that it's going to happen. What can we do? I'm going to talk about 3 sort of different levels that we can approach. One of them, we need to change our strategic approach. So at a very high level, we need to rethink about how we apply, and again, I'm talking broad brush, national policies, doctrine, the things that really do create that graphic you see on the right, where everything is this beautiful linear path from unified command to local emergency operations center to state emergency operations center to, like, we need to get away from that and truly embrace this whole idea that not only do disasters not respect borders, they may not respect much of anything. We may have on our island a couple of hundred folks, maybe one of whom has heard about ICS, and a lot of them who just are neighbors trying to help neighbors. We've got to get away from the idea that there's a linear or a series of linear processes that are going to make everything better, and actually really embrace this second piece of it's not just going to be government. Like right now, strategically, we need to be engaging everybody in the whole community, from grocers and large grocery chains, who may have the ability to move things around from distribution centers and get it out in ways that we could never imagine as government, to local folks who strategically are out in our communities, who are out there and able to do things to fill these gaps. We've got to start engaging those now and do it as a strategy, not as something cool we do in my county, but we don't really embrace in a different county, or something that's really prevalent on the East Coast, but not really, we don't really care about it so much on the West Coast. Strategically, we really need to commit to that. Second, our operational approach. We've got to look at our plans and start thinking about how we plan for islands and not for jurisdictional borders. If strategically we're admitting and saying, hey, you know what? We can look at the data, we can look at the modeling, and we can assume that, yeah, this is not going to happen the way it should in a neat one-size-fits-all, boxes moving next to boxes, arrow by arrow. Our plans need to be amended to actually address that specifically. And then we need to actually, like we do with everything else, we need to train to those plans, and we need to exercise them. Even if we embrace this in terms of planning, even if we start training people on the different islands, and that can be through lots of different venues, from incident command training to community emergency response team training. In Washington and in our county, we really embrace Map Your Neighborhoods, so neighborhoods learn how to work together. Even if we look at all of that, eventually we've got to actually do multi-jurisdictional exercises. And when I say multi-jurisdictional in this context, what I really mean is multi-island. Because it may be that you work literally in a city in Snohomish County, but when the ground starts shaking, even though you're in the same city, you're actually on a different island. We've got to start talking about how islands are going to help islands, and not necessarily how cities are going to help cities or counties are going to help counties, because an island that starts, in my case, a great example is Camano Island, which is part of Island County, may be unreachable by the Island County government for a long, long time. We've got to start acting like these things are actually things that we practice for real and exercise accordingly. And then finally, at the tactical level, we got to look at things a lot differently here. And this is like boots on the ground, right? So there's a dropped overpass from Northridge. It's going to take a while to fix that. Imagine that there are some folks on both sides who are going to actually have to get things together and get some level of organization. We as emergency managers, as first responders, kind of again, across our culture, need to accept that that may not be the pretty picture painted in doctrine or in the ICS class we took, or whatever version of that, that we've had in a classroom. We're going to have to accept that it may be a local community leader who stands up and says, hey, I need you 3 to do this and you 3 to do that and 4 other folks to do something else. those ad hoc structures actually have to be part of our tactical approach. And instead of sort of fighting that and going, well, those folks aren't really trained, so we don't want them to do this, actually embrace that and figure out how to employ them in a way that actually works when they need the help, not when we can get them to train folks to show them what help they need. They know the help they need. We've got to accept that they're going to have to figure out how to make that happen. We've got to incorporate every force multiplier. Sorry, I'm a military guy in the past. But every force multiplier, and a great example is ham radio operators. Many of you may be out on these islands. You actually will be able to help us because those ad hoc structures, you can connect them to others who can help them help us. And that's going to have to be everything. It might be a ham radio operator. It might be somebody who doesn't necessarily work for a public works department, but knows how to run heavy equipment. After SR 530, we had lots of folks in the logging community of Darrington who knew how to do things like that. We've got to actually use them, every single one of them, to the best of our ability and the best of their ability. And then finally, at a tactical level, tailor our preparedness efforts towards those, and I apologize for reading, but just to be clear, those unused to island living. I mentioned earlier, I lived in Wyoming for a long time. There are folks in the middle of the winter who are out in the frontier land who can live for months at a time because they've stockpiled and they know how to take care of themselves and they know how to fix everything. In the central Puget Sound, there are lots of folks who don't. We've got to tailor preparedness efforts to teach them and emphasize that on the wrong side of that island border, on the wrong side of that overpass, might be your plumber, might be your electrician, might be the gas company. You might have to really learn how to shut off your gas because no one's going to be able to make it to you. We're going to have to teach folks and tailor our preparedness efforts toward really building more of an island culture where communities have to help communities and not be reliant on local first responders to come do that work for them. So wrapping up, all I'm going to say is this should not surprise us. We know that Cascadia is a geological certainty. We know it's happened many times. We know there are other things that happen every year on a much smaller scale, but things that happen that create islands in our communities. So none of this should catch us off guard. In my opinion, failing to prepare for it is really a failure. And we said this after 9/11, a failure of imagination. Back then, we didn't want to imagine that anyone would do the horrible things that were done on 9/11. Sometimes we don't want to imagine how bad Cascadia could actually be. We don't want to imagine that amount of devastation or damage. But this really can't surprise us. So I hope over the last 45 minutes or so, maybe that's sunk in a little bit. I'd love to hear other folks' thoughts about it. I really appreciate your time. Certainly, if you want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn. You can reach me via email, and there's actually my office phone. So please, if you'd like to connect, feel free to reach out. I'm intending to be with you all today to take questions if I can. If not, I hope you enjoyed it. And thanks very much for your time. I appreciate it.